The air was thick with August humidity as Richard Nelson stepped out of his car, his worn sneakers landing lightly on the pavement outside Blue Ridge Police Department. The sun glared overhead, casting long shadows across the precinct's parking lot, where officers moved about, some heading inside, others laughing as they leaned against their squad cars. Richard adjusted the brim of his baseball cap, pulling it lower to shield his face. His plaid shirt, slightly wrinkled from the long drive, hung loosely over his faded jeans, and his hands were shoved casually into his pockets. He knew what he looked like, just another man wandering in off the street, a nobody. And that was exactly what he wanted. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. This wasn't just another day. This was the start of something bigger. Richard had spent 2 decades in law enforcement, working his way up from a rookie cop to a highly respected officer known for his integrity and leadership. His recent promotion to chief of police for Blue Ridge was a major milestone. But he knew better than to trust the polished smiles and rehearsed welcomes that often came with a new leadership change. This department had a reputation. Whispers of corruption, racism, and unchecked misconduct ran through the community like a silent current. If he was going to fix it, he needed to see the truth for himself. So he had made a decision. He wouldn't walk in wearing his uniform, wouldn't arrive with an official announcement. No cameras, no press, no grand entrance. Instead, he would come in disguised as an ordinary man and observe his officers unfiltered, unmasked, raw. Would they treat him with respect? Or would they reveal exactly what needed to be changed? Richard entered through the side door of the station, his steps slow, deliberate. The hallways buzzed with conversation. Officers exchanging stories, the occasional chuckle from the break room, the hum of ringing phones and clicking keyboards. The air smelled of stale coffee and old paperwork, a scent he knew well. No one looked twice at him. Perfect. He continued forward, scanning the room, noting who held authority in casual interactions, who dominated conversations, who stood back and observed. But just as he neared the break room, a sharp voice cut through the noise. "Hey, you." The chatter died down. Heads turned. Richard stopped mid-step, slowly looking up to see a stocky white officer striding toward him. The man's badge read, Officer Daniels. His uniform was neatly pressed, his belt heavy with equipment, his posture oozing arrogance. Behind him, a few other officers stood watching with interest, some leaning against desks, arms crossed, waiting. Richard opened his mouth to speak, but Daniels didn't give him the chance. "Lost, are we?" Daniels sneered, his voice loud enough for the room to hear. "This isn't a shelter, buddy. You need to take that mess somewhere else." Laughter rumbled through the group behind him. Richard felt his jaw tighten, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had expected some hostility, but this was worse than he had imagined. Before he could respond, Daniel stepped closer, his voice rising. "Didn't you hear me? Get out of here. We don't need people like you hanging around." More laughter. Someone slapped a desk, shaking their head in amusement. Another muttered something about keeping the riffraff away. Richard's pulse pounded in his ears. He could have ended it right there, could have stated his name, revealed his rank, and watched the smirks vanish in an instant. But he didn't. He wanted to see just how far this would go. Daniel's smirk widened as he leaned in closer, his breath hot and laced with coffee. Then, in one swift motion, he spit. Richard barely had time to react before he felt the warm saliva hit his cheek, sliding down his skin. A chorus of laughter erupted around the room. One officer doubled over, slapping the table in hysterics. Another just shook his head, grinning. Richard's fist clenched at his sides, his breathing slow and controlled. His entire career had been built on discipline, patience, knowing when to strike. This was a test, and he wasn't going to fail it. Slowly, he reached into his pocket, pulling out a handkerchief. Without a word, he wiped his face, his movements deliberate. Then, finally, he spoke. "Is this how you treat everyone who walks through these doors?" Daniel shrugged, the smirk never leaving his lips. "Only the ones who don't belong here." Laughter exploded again, filling the room. Richard nodded slightly, pressing his lips together. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. No yelling, no threats, no warnings. Just a silent, measured exit. And behind him, the officers continued to laugh, completely unaware that their lives were about to change forever. Richard walked toward the main office, his footsteps measured, his mind racing. A few seconds later, the intercom crackled to life. "All personnel, Report to the briefing room immediately." It was time. As Richard entered the large conference room through a side door, he watched as officers filed in. Some held coffee mugs, others still chuckled about what had just happened. Daniel stood near the wall, arms crossed, his smirk still plastered on his face. He had no idea. At the front of the room, Captain Harris, a stout, aging officer with a graying mustache, cleared his throat. "All right, settle down. We've got an important introduction today." The room quieted. Curious glances exchanged. Harris continued. "As most of you know, Chief Caldwell retired last month. Today, I'm pleased to introduce our new leader, a man with an impressive record and a strong vision for this department." Silence fell over the room as Richard stepped forward. He placed a folder on the podium, lifted his head, and slowly scanned the room. Daniel's smirk faltered. The blood drained from his face. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some officers froze in place, others exchanged uneasy glances. Richard took a deep breath. Then, in a voice calm, steady, unshakable, he said, "Good morning. My name is Richard Nelson. As of today, I am your new chief of police." The room went completely, utterly silent. Daniels turned red, his bravado evaporating in an instant. Richard held his gaze for a long moment before sweeping his eyes across the entire department. They thought they had put him in his place. But now, it was his turn. The sun hung low in the August sky, casting a golden haze over the small city of Blue Ridge, North Carolina. The heat was thick, clinging to everything like an invisible weight. Richard Nelson, the newly appointed chief of police, pulled into the precinct's parking lot, his hands firm on the steering wheel. From the outside, the Blue Ridge Police Department looked like any other: clean brick exterior, crisp, white lettering above the entrance. But Richard knew appearances could be deceiving. This department had a reputation, one stained with whispers of corruption, misconduct, and racial bias. The community didn't trust its officers, and even within the force, there were grumblings about the new black police chief. Richard wasn't naive. He knew resistance was inevitable, but he wasn't here to demand respect with his title. He wanted to earn it, or at the very least, expose those who refused to give it. And to do that, he needed to see the truth, unfiltered and raw. Richard killed the engine and took a moment to survey the area. The parking lot buzzed with life. Officers coming and going, some engaged in casual conversations, others moving with the usual urgency of police work. He grabbed his baseball cap from the passenger seat and pulled it low over his forehead. His plaid shirt was slightly rumpled from the drive, his worn jeans and scuffed sneakers blending him into the background. He didn't look like a man with 20 years of law enforcement experience. He didn't look like a man about to take charge of this department. And that was exactly the point. As he stepped out of the car, he kept his posture relaxed, hands in his pockets, his steps unhurried. He moved like an observer, not an authority figure. No one spared him a second glance. Good. Richard walked toward the side entrance of the precinct, his ears tuned to the conversations happening around him. "You hear about the new chief?" one officer asked as he leaned against a patrol car. "Yeah, some guy from upstate. Can't believe they put a black guy in charge here. Man, you know how it is. Politics." Richard's jaw tensed, but he kept walking. The automatic doors hissed open, and he stepped inside. The familiar smell of stale coffee and old paperwork filled the air. Phones rang in the distance. Officers were scattered throughout the room, some at their desks, others engaged in side conversations. Richard moved through the space like a ghost, unnoticed. He walked past a group of officers, catching snatches of conversation about weekend plans, cases, and office gossip. No one paid him any attention until he neared the break room. That's when everything changed. Richard moved carefully through the precinct, absorbing every detail. The way officers spoke to each other, the hierarchy of respect, the tension that lingered beneath casual conversations. Then, just as he passed the break room, a sharp voice cut through the air. "Hey, you." The room fell silent. Conversations died down. All eyes turned toward Richard. He slowly lifted his head, meeting the gaze of the man walking toward him, a stocky white officer with a cocky smirk. The badge on his chest read, "Officer Daniels." Richard said nothing, waiting. Daniels tilted his head, eyeing Richard up and down like he was inspecting something filthy that had wandered in from the street. Then, in a loud, condescending tone, he sneered. "Lost, are we? This ain't no shelter. Take your mess somewhere else." A snicker came from one of the officers nearby. Another one leaned back in his chair, smirking. Richard's jaw tensed, but he forced himself to stay calm. Daniels, misinterpreting his silence as hesitation, stepped forward, his voice growing louder, making sure everyone could hear. "Didn't you hear me? Get the hell out. We don't need people like you hanging around." Behind him, the other officers laughed openly, their amusement rippling through the room. Richard's heart pounded, not from fear, but from rage. Still, he said nothing. Daniel's eyes glimmered with amusement, clearly enjoying himself. He took another step forward, his voice dripping with arrogance. "I said move it, boy." Laughter exploded again. Richard's fingers curled into fists. He could feel his pulse thudding in his ears. But he still didn't react, because he wanted to see just how far this man would go. Daniels, emboldened by the laughter of his colleagues, leaned in closer. His mouth twisted into a mocking grin. Then, without warning, he spat. Warm saliva splattered against Richard's cheek, dripping down his skin. For a moment, time stopped. The room erupted in laughter. One officer slapped the desk, doubling over in hysterics. Another shook his head, grinning, as if this were just another joke. Someone muttered, "That'll teach him where he belongs." Richard stood completely still. His blood boiled beneath his skin. His hands itched to react, but he didn't. Slowly, methodically, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a handkerchief. Without a word, he wiped his face, his movements slow, deliberate. Then, finally, he spoke. His voice was calm, cold, steady. "Is this how you treat everyone who walks through these doors?" Daniel smirked, crossing his arms. "Only the ones who don't belong here." More laughter. Richard nodded slightly, his expression unreadable. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. No yelling, no threats, no reaction, just silence. And as he strode down the hallway, leaving the laughter behind him, he knew one thing for certain: the joke wouldn't last much longer. The sound of static crackled through the precinct's intercom. Then came the announcement. "All personnel, report to the briefing room immediately." A ripple of confused murmurs spread across the precinct. Officers set down their coffee mugs, pushed back from their desks, and started making their way toward the large conference room at the center of the building. Officer Daniels, still grinning smugly, leaned against the wall outside the break room, arms crossed. "Wonder what this is about," one officer muttered as they filed into the room. "Probably some boring policy update," another said, stifling a yawn. Daniels chuckled, still reveling in his morning entertainment. He had no idea. Inside the briefing room, officers settled into their seats, some whispering among themselves, others scrolling through their phones. The room buzzed with idle conversation. Then, at the front of the room, Captain Harris, a stout man with a graying mustache, stood up, clearing his throat. The chatter died down. "All right, settle down," Harris said, his voice carrying across the room. "We've got an important introduction today." Daniels barely paid attention, still riding the high of humiliating the stranger from earlier. Until today, we welcome our new police chief. Daniels' smirk froze. His arms uncrossed slightly, a flicker of unease creeping onto his face. Then, from the side entrance of the room, footsteps echoed against the tile floor. A man stepped forward. Richard Nelson. He walked slowly, deliberately, his eyes scanning the room as he approached the podium at the front. The second Daniels saw him, his face drained of color. His hands twitched. His breath caught in his throat. The room fell into stunned silence. For the first time since stepping into the precinct that morning, Richard wasn't invisible. Now, all eyes were on him. A wave of shock rippled through the room. Some officers sat frozen, their jaws clenched. Others exchanged wide-eyed glances, whispering among themselves. A few younger officers, those still uncertain of the culture here, looked nervously between Richard and Daniels. Daniels, still standing at the back of the room, swallowed hard. His smirk was gone. His hands tightened into fists at his sides. Beads of sweat formed at his hairline, though he barely seemed to breathe. Richard placed a folder on the podium, took a deep breath, then lifted his gaze, and locked eyes with Daniels. Then, in a voice calm, steady, and laced with authority, he spoke. "Good morning. My name is Richard Nelson. As of today, I am your new chief of police." The words hung heavy in the air, pressing down on the room like an invisible force. Daniels blinked rapidly, his Adam's apple bobbing as he forced down a swallow. The silence stretched on, thick with tension. Richard let the weight of his words settle over them all. Then, finally, he let his gaze sweep across the room, making sure every single officer felt it. They thought they had put him in his place. But now, It was his turn. The silence in the briefing room was deafening. Every officer sat rigid, their eyes locked onto Richard Nelson, who stood firm behind the podium, his expression unreadable. He wasn't angry. No raised voice. No explosive outrage. Just a cold, deliberate calm, the kind that sent a chill through the room. Then, with the weight of authority behind every word, he spoke. I walked into this precinct today as an ordinary man. His voice was measured, each syllable cutting through the air like steel. And I saw everything I needed to see. A shift rippled through the crowd. A few officers stiffened. Others averted their gazes. Richard let the tension simmer for a moment. Then his tone sharpened. The behavior I witnessed this morning wasn't just unprofessional. It was unacceptable. The weight of the statement hung heavy in the air. He took a step forward. The culture of abuse, the arrogance, the blatant disrespect, it ends today. Daniels flinched, his posture suddenly less assured. But Richard wasn't done. He let his eyes sweep across the room, making sure every officer felt the pressure of his next words. You wear a badge, but do you honor it? Silence. Some officers shifted in their seats. Some looked away, but no one answered. Richard's eyes locked onto Daniels. Then, without breaking eye contact, he stepped down from the podium. His footsteps were slow, controlled, intentional. With each step toward Daniels, the officer seemed to shrink, his usual cocky demeanor evaporating. By the time Richard stood inches away, Daniels was visibly trembling. For the first time all morning, he didn't look so sure of himself. Richard held him in his gaze, eyes unwavering. Then, in a voice that was low, firm, and absolute, he said, When you spat on me this morning, you didn't just disrespect me. Daniels swallowed hard. Richard didn't blink. You disgraced the badge you wear, the oath you swore, and the very people you claim to protect. Daniels opened his mouth, his voice stammering. I didn't know. Richard cut him off sharply. That's the problem. Daniels' breath hitched. The room was so silent, you could hear a pin drop. Richard took a step closer, his voice dropping to a deadly calm. You didn't care to know. You didn't take a second to think before you acted. Because you assumed the man standing in front of you didn't matter. Daniel's throat bobbed as he swallowed nervously. Richard held his gaze for a moment longer before turning his attention back to the room. Richard straightened his shoulders, his voice commanding the entire precinct. Starting today, officers like Daniels will be removed. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Daniels' eyes widened, his mouth parting as if to protest. But Richard wasn't finished. There will be no tolerance for anyone who disrespects this department, this community, or the integrity of this badge. Murmurs spread through the room. A few officers glanced at each other uneasily. Some looked down, ashamed. Daniels, meanwhile, was frozen in place, his face drained of color. Then Richard spoke his next words without hesitation. Effective immediately, Officer Daniels is suspended pending an internal investigation. A collective silence gripped the room. Daniels' face turned crimson. His fists clenched, but no one defended him. Because deep down, they knew he deserved it. Richard let his words settle, making sure every single officer in that room understood. This was just the beginning. The following weeks were anything but easy. Richard moved swiftly, launching an internal review of every officer in the department. Files were pulled. Complaints that had been buried were reopened. Every misconduct report was reviewed with fresh scrutiny. And those who failed to uphold the values of the badge, they were removed. Some fought back, trying to challenge suspensions and dismissals. Others quickly realized that Richard Nelson was not a man to be swayed. But not everyone was beyond redemption. Some officers, especially the younger recruits, saw the writing on the wall. They began to change, not out of fear, but because for the first time in years, they had a leader who stood for something real. The ones who genuinely wanted to serve and protect, the officers who had stayed silent before out of fear, now felt empowered to do their jobs with integrity. The shift wasn't immediate. It wasn't perfect, but it was happening. Richard knew that cleaning up the precinct was only half the battle. The people of Blue Ridge had long since lost trust in their police force. And trust, once broken, isn't easily repaired. So Richard did something most chiefs never did. He left his office and walked into the community. He attended local events, spoke at neighborhood meetings, and spent time at schools, youth centers, and churches. He didn't go in with speeches or empty promises. He went in to listen. One afternoon, during a community gathering at a local park, a small boy tentatively approached him. He was no older than 8 or 9, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his too big hoodie. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Are you really the police chief?" Richard crouched down to meet the boy's gaze. "I am." The boy hesitated. Then, after a moment, he blurted out the question that had been weighing on his mind. "My dad says the police don't care about us." A quiet murmur passed through the group nearby. Some people nodded in agreement. Others simply watched, waiting to see how Richard would respond. Richard took a slow breath. He wouldn't make false promises. He wouldn't sugarcoat history. Instead, he met the boy's eyes and answered truthfully. "I can't change the past." A pause. Then, he gave the only promise that mattered. "But I promise you, we're working to do better." The boy studied him for a moment. Then, for the first time, a small smile tugged at his lips. And in that moment, Richard knew this was why he had taken the job. Not for the title, not for the power, but to make real change. By the end of his first year, the Blue Ridge Police Department looked very different. The worst officers were gone, their corruption rooted out and removed. The good ones, the ones who had been overshadowed, afraid to speak up, were now leading by example. And the community? They began to notice. For the first time in years, people didn't just see the police as a threat. They saw officers actually listening, actually showing up when needed. It wasn't perfect. It would never be perfect, but it was better. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the precinct, Richard stood in the hallway, watching his officers laugh, talk, and prepare to head home. This time, the laughter wasn't at someone's expense. It was genuine. It was different. Daniels was long gone. In his place, a new wave of officers, young and old, worked side by side, building something worth believing in. Richard let out a breath, a small, tired smile tugging at his lips. "Change isn't easy," he murmured to himself. Then, with one last glance at the precinct he had fought so hard to transform, he finished the thought. "But it's worth every single fight." If this story made you think, don't just scroll away. Take action. Like this video to help spread awareness. Share it with your friends and family, because conversations spark change. Comment below and tell us your thoughts. Have you ever witnessed an abuse of power? Let's talk about it. Follow our channel for more powerful real-life stories. And turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Change starts with awareness. Awareness starts with you. Be part of the movement.